live on YouTube. And okay, we've got 13 participants already who found their seats. Thank you very much. I'll just give everyone a little more time to find their way out of the GatherTown environment. I know it's a little weird when you're standing there and then the poster just vaporizes in front of your very eyes. But I didn't have a sort of a nicer way to do that. At least that's why I send those 5-minute warnings to let everyone know that be prepared. You need to wrap up your conversations and so on. So we've got some participants here. We've got a few people on YouTube, so that's great. I'm going to turn the screen off because there's a delay on YouTube and it's weird to see myself on a delay.
Oh, you can see the...
Yeah, I can see both and it's a bit strange. So, so let me start by saying it's a real pleasure to have Ayanna make the time for us to have a live Q&A. And the second thing, which I just said to Ayanna, is that I'm so excited because there's this form for offline questions. And, you know, I recorded those little bits of me at the end saying, submit the question. And so far we haven't gotten any, but this time we do. And so that speaks to the people who watched all the way through and we're still craving more. So so thank you for that. And so I've got a set of questions myself, but I'm of course going to prioritize the audience. I can talk to you some other time. So thank you, Ayanna, for showing up here. Can I read you the first question that we've got?
Yes, let's do this.
Okay, so the first question says, thank you for this very interesting and entertaining talk. My question is not so much about evaluating bias in AI, but exploiting the shown lack of some types of bias when interacting with robots. If humans perceive a robot primarily as a robot instead of assigning human attributes like gender or race, do you see a potential to exploit this in order to reduce unwanted preconceptions or biases in human-human relations? For example, if there are human female and male nurses, but also robot nurses, can the existence of the robot nurse reduce the difference between female and male nurses? That's the first question.
Yes, in fact, my student just received Best Paper Award on a study where she showed this. It was in where people have uncertainty in terms of recognition, emotion recognition. And what we find is that we can use AI to basically close the gap or mitigate or retrain ourselves in terms of our own biases and make us more aware. And so we have not done that with respect to the form factor in terms of the embodiment, but based on that preliminary data, I think it can be done. And the key though is that typically people have the most bias when they have uncertainty. So if I'm having to evaluate someone else and I have high uncertainty because either I haven't been exposed to, maybe I've never had a male nurse because, you know, there are more female nurses, and then a male comes in and they're a nurse, there's a cognitive mismatch. And so that's when AI can really help us in terms of making us aware that, you know, you have a bias because you have this preconceived notion, you have this difference of a lived experience, but then also basically be the interface to mitigate some of the decisions that we might make because of those biases.
Yeah, no, that's excellent. Actually, it's interesting what you said. You just you reminded me of so I'm South African, and when I grew up, when I started elementary school, our schools were still segregated. I was in a white-only school. Yeah, you were talking about saying don't look that old. Yeah, well,
you sure don't. I'm like, hold it. You're like, we're the same age.
Yeah, no, right. And but what happened was I had, you know, all white, predominantly male teachers, and then they integrated, of course, slowly. But I had, for a period of time, there was one term where we learned English and Afrikaans and Zulu, and there was a white guy teaching us Zulu who would then get confused, and then he would ask the new black teacher that we had, for whom it was his native language, right? And he could, and then of course they sorted that out, and the person who was, but it was the contrast of, first of all, seeing someone who was new in a teacher position, you became aware of the fact that, oh, this is something new, and then it's amazing how quickly that just you become aware of it, and then you just familiarize and you train yourself away from that, right? You weren't aware it was there. It becomes obvious that it was there, and then you kind of address that. So this idea that the way you said this about sort of how we can adapt because of that just reminded me of over a period of a year, I could see how I would have changed in thinking about these things. And so I completely buy that.
But the thing is, and this is where AI and robotics is, that a lot of times people are not aware, right? And I think this is the thing. But for most people, I believe in people. For the most part, when people become aware, they try to adapt. And I think it's really where AI and robotics can fit in, is that part of let's make someone aware of the fact that they're treating someone different, or their interactions are different, or their decisions are different. Let's make them aware that there's some aspects of a difference of lived experience.
No, that's right. I'm going to, so far, that's the best phrase of the conference. I believe in people. That's great. Yes. Excellent. So I've got another question we've started, but I just want to, that we got that was submitted beforehand, also an excellent question, but we have the Q&A channel here. So please, anyone who's watching, if you'd like to write a question, or if you would like to say a question, you can write, I'd like to say my question. And if you've got a microphone ready, then we can promote you. And, this is intended to be like an actual Q&A. So, but if you're more comfortable sending a written question, that's fine too. I'll certainly take those. So the second question, also a really thought-provoking one. Many of us at RSS are working on research that will make it easier and more accessible for people who aren't robotics experts to teach and provide data to robots. It would certainly make sense to me to use a specialized learner in these deployed systems. But are there steps we should be taking to detect and avoid bias in our robots as they're gathering learning data?
Yeah, so this is an open-ended kind of conversation, and it's been for a while, about the data. And so I have two philosophies. One is the fact that we will never collect enough data to represent all the differences in the groups, right? So I may say, okay, we're going to really focus on gender, but then I might forget that, there's other categories of gender. There's binary, right? And so when I think about gender, male, female, and so how do I then switch and say, oh, I need to collect data on other kinds of identities, gender identities, and things like that. And so what I always believe in is to be conscious that the data will always have bias. We just can't remove that, because we all have some unique aspects. But what we can do is think about the opposite. So I always say is, whoever you are in terms of your data collection process, think about your characteristics and the person that's opposite. So I identify as female. So when I'm collecting data, I'm going to naturally think about, oh, I need to make sure I have good gender representation. But then I also should think about, oh, well, maybe I should explicitly think about my counter. So male. In terms of my age, I won't tell you how old I am, but I'm older. So I'm going to forget about the fact that there's like 3-year-olds. And so I'm going to think about the opposite. So one of the things we find is that that's this aspect of awareness. If you're collecting data, it also makes you explicitly think about your characteristics and the opposite. And by going down that journey, you start to fill in the other gaps in between. It's one of the, we've done a couple of tests, and it's one of the best ways for you to really think about it. Doesn't clear up all the biases, but at least gets us to the point of having a better representation as we're feeding in these machine learning algorithms, as we're feeding in these attributes that we need to learn.
So I can see that. I can see that certainly in the case when it's sort of some sort of supervised learning setup where you've got the database of data and you crunch on it. But if it's more of a reinforcement learning setting where the robot has to take actions, I wonder, to acquire the data, right? I wonder, we talk about sort of epsilon softness to make sure that there's enough exploration, I guess. And I wonder if there's something where you could look and you could say, well, we're exploring, but we don't seem to be exploring enough in these dimensions. So maybe we need some softness in some of these ways. I'm not quite sure, because when I read the question, it says, what steps should we be taking to detect and avoid bias as our robots are gathering learning data? So maybe they mean steps specifically that we should codify for the robot. So then maybe it's a question of think of yourself, think of your opposite, and then make sure that you've kind of got balance in both of these somehow.
Yeah, so in terms of a technique, you're probably familiar with this, although most younger folks are not. You remember the old simulated annealing approach?
Absolutely, yeah.
And we don't use it enough. But remember what simulated annealing was, is if you're doing a search and you get into basically a local minimum, a local maximum, right? Like simulated annealing was that, like, kind of shaking it up so you would move outside of the domain just in case you were at a local minimum. We could do the same thing if we're thinking about these robotic systems. I mean, we have to think about the safety because you just don't want to pop over into an area that you can't recover from. But if you're doing a search, even if you're just a robot doing a navigation, and you basically put in a randomization in terms of what you're doing, that may not seem logical in terms of your algorithm, but is logical because it makes you move into a different direction or a different space. We know that it works. I mean, it worked really, really, really well back in the day. If you have physical hardware, this question of is how do you do this safely? Or if you're learning how to manipulate, how do you make sure you don't go into a singularity where it's detrimental to the hardware?
Right.
But I think there's something there as well.
Yeah, no, definitely a nice research topic, right? Think about how to do that kind of bounded by the constraints of safety and some of those things. Yeah, that's excellent. So I'm going to pause because I have to do this with my students sometimes. Pause to give an awkward silence to see if we can elicit a question. And if we don't, I will ask the question. So here's one.
Wait, that wasn't an awkward pause. You filled in the gaps with ums.
Okay. I'll pause a little longer. Oh, okay. No, okay. Well, that felt awkward to me. I don't know. We didn't get any extra cues, so let me ask you a question, which I'd be genuinely, maybe I wasn't awkward enough because I keep thinking about this question that I'm curious about, and I would like your point of view on, which is you gave this example of the gorillas example in your talk, and one of the things you said is that there was 3 stages. There was the result, and then there was sort of some fanfare or some response to that by social media, by various people, and then there was the response to that by us, the engineers, which is to say, remove that as a label, right? And I thought you made a really nice point that's not really the responsible thing to do. We're not going to learn from that as engineers. We're failing in that regard. What I'm curious about is your view on the immediate response. So I wonder sort of. So I'm in 2 minds about this. I'm not. Obviously, social media is powered by attention, and so outrage is one way to get attention, right? But there are good things to be genuinely outraged about. So I'm kind of unclear how I feel on this. On the one side, people will talk about, they will use the phrase social justice warriors, and they use this in a pejorative sense, right? So they'll say people. So I'm just trying to get a sense of what your thoughts are there. I completely got the point of your talk, which was that the response to that was completely inappropriate, and as engineers, we need to do better. But what I'm not sure about is sort of whether this fanfare of outrage is something which we should be using as a litmus test or not, or what's your feeling on that?
Yeah, so I think, what outrage is about is because you feel that you've been wronged and no one is listening. So typically people don't necessarily get outraged if you generally think that someone is doing something for the good and they made a mistake, right? And the fact is I think as researchers, we tend not to admit that we will make a mistake. We say something like, oh, this algorithm is 99% accurate, right? But we don't really admit that 1% could kill someone, right? We don't talk about that. And I think that that's something that we need to relearn and redo. So in the medical, because I do, research in the medical space, they disclose these things, right? They will say, it's 99% accurate, but, for this target demographic or for these contradictions, or right? Like they provide that data so that you coming in will look at it and be like, oh, I know my space. I know where this works. And I also know where it doesn't work. And we don't do that. We don't say like, hey, this works in terms of these conditions and it does not work. That's the key. It does not work in these conditions. And I don't like the media, social media, profiling and things like that. But right now, until we waken up and take claims, it's really the only way that people have of expressing the fact that they don't feel heard. in general.
Oh, no, that's a good, I like that take on that. Yeah, yeah. And it's interesting because actually one of the things I've written down here was, I for a while had been thinking quite a lot about publication bias in the sense of negative results being things which are not publishable. And that's kind of a little bit of what you're talking about, is like, there's also a reason why people don't tell you so much about the downside, right? Is maybe the reviewers will say, I don't think we're going to take this paper. Or you seldom see a robotics paper where the paper says, these are the things we tried. This is the standard control stack, this is the standard navigation stack, and it completely failed in this miserable way, and we need to do better. We just don't really have a venue for those sorts of stories. So I thought a little bit about this, and some years ago ran a workshop at RSS where we discussed a little bit of this and what they've been doing in some of the other communities to try to think about this. And of course, when you get into medicine, then and health, there's a whole different extra layer of complexity because of the funding mechanisms are perhaps people who have they have some skin in the game. They want their drug to do better than the placebo or whatever. And fortunately, we're not at that point yet. But one of the things that I know, and I'm not an IRB expert, but I know that one of the mechanisms that they talk about is pre-registering a study, right? So you have to say that this is what the study is going to be about, and this is what we're going to do, and it made me wonder a little bit about if you're going to do a study, maybe there's a way we could try to mitigate some of these effects of this hidden regularity in the data sets, perhaps by pre-declaring what it is that you're going to look for in the data set, or what the data set needs to have, and then there could be some critique. But you kind of already said this data set question is a big question, and it's not one we're going to answer in a 5-minute conversation. But I wonder sort of what techniques are out there, and I'm not thinking necessarily about sort of regulatory techniques, but rather just so maybe best practices.
Yeah, so I think, one of the things you had said, we're not there, like medicine and medical has some, skin in the game. We're getting there. So, as researchers, we may think, oh, but we're just doing this algorithm. But now our algorithms are being integrated into these medical applications and into surveillance and into self-driving cars and into these applications that actually can cause harms. So I think this whole thing of like, we're not there, if we're not careful, something is going to be imposed on us where we're going to have to think about this, and we're not going to be prepared. And right now we have a say, but as soon as NIST and government that's funding starts saying, oh, guess what? In order to get any funding, you have to do all of this paperwork like you have to do for like FDA. It's going to be on their terms and not on our terms. And so this is something that I think we need to think about. So some of the best practices, and we see this at least in some of we say things that are coming out. There's things like model cards where you document where the data was from, the characteristics of the data, whatever, if there's demographics for it, if there's pose information, like kind of all this. And that is associated with the algorithm. So when you're putting stuff up on like GitHub, like we tend to do, you also have this, and this is how I actually extracted the data, or this is where I received it from. I would like to see, and you had mentioned, your workshop on the negative. I would love to see like a workshop on, well thought about experiments that didn't work. Because I don't know about you, but I mean, my students, when they read a paper, they will call up the researcher and they're like, oh, what about this? And usually it's another student be like, yeah, I tried that. Let me tell you, right? Like,
yeah, that's right.
All this background story when you talk to the researchers, when you talk to us.
And that's what's great about a poster session or something where you can talk to the person, because they'll tell you all the things that really happen. But the big caveat there is, you said, well designed, right? It's easy for me to make a flaky robot. I've got those all day long, right? The question is whether that's on me or whether whether I did follow, use traditional techniques and I'm thorough, or did I just write bad code? And that seems to be the part which makes it quite difficult for engineered systems. But we've got another question here, and I don't know if this is if the person's name is pronounced Carrie Moses or Karis. So sorry about that, but take it either way. So I'll read this out. As engineers, we often hear that we need to consider the social and ethical implications of our work. For people who work on theory, how can this be put into practice? Our work has huge potential benefits, but also huge potential negative effects. For example, the Boston Dynamics spot robot being used by the New York Police Department. Is there a way to take this into consideration at the research level? Or is the answer to stay involved in tech policy, outreach, advocacy, and so forth?
So both. So tech policy, outreach, I think as engineers and computer scientists, we need to stay involved in that because, again, the decisions are being made by typically non-technologists, which is detrimental to our field. But one of the things about the technology, just so you know, there is currently a National Academy of Engineering committee, because I'm on it. We're actually looking at this responsible computing aspect and what does it take to be responsible in computing research at all levels. So what you consider theory or more applied. And so one of the things that we think about in terms of the theory, a lot of times when you're working on theory, for example, you don't necessarily know how it's going to be used, right? Because you're not necessarily tied to one application, it's some fundamentals. But one of the suggestions though is you do know what kind of application. So if you're working on, a new vision algorithm and you're doing some like 3D pose estimation, right? And maybe you don't know it's being used for X or later on. You kind of have an idea of like, what is the holy grail for you? Like, if this is successful, what would you like to see it being used in? Is it in camera systems? Is it in X? And I think by thinking about it that way, you can start to weave in well, let me think about the criteria that I'm using. Maybe I should be thinking about the lighting constraints. Maybe I should be thinking about the energy constraints. Maybe I should be thinking about, all these things that when you get to the application stage, you worry like, oh, I'm having too many GPU, right? Like you're there and you're like, oh, that theory was lovely, but now implementation, I have to worry about, the energy and sustainability and the environment. But those I think are things you can think about because it will change your choices in terms of your algorithms and your parameters. If you know that if you change this minus to a plus, it's going to eventually take less computation, but you get the same result. Like that's power, because that means when it does get to the play person, you've already thought about it in theory and you've made a choice and you've made a selection that actually helps down the line. And so just one of the suggestions, it's going to be a bunch of suggestions coming out in the report for what we call fundamentalists, core research at the theory level, but even thinking about the responsibility at that level.
Can you just say the name of it's the National Academy?
NAE, Responsible Computing Research.
Thank you. So, one thing that also strikes me is that I'm a little on the, perhaps not theory but maybe a bit closer to the theory side of robotics than the hardware side, let's say, or the system side. And so occasionally I read these papers that are by theory people where they've taken into account some of the things we would like. And I'm thinking of Cynthia DeWalk's, fundamental work on differential privacy, right? And saying like, we don't want to, this idea that there's a distinction where it's sort of either you have privacy or you have utility, and just saying like, that's a false choice. We can have something between, and then doing really interesting theoretical work to do that. I think there's another way of turning it. It's not something extra to do in the sense of extra, it's a whole set of new opportunities for us to try to think about these constraints. And I mean, specifically for privacy, that's pretty clear, but there are other things like safety and so many other aspects of robotics, right? Robots are so complicated. There's so much going on.
There are, and again, if you are interested in this aspect of bias, privacy, fairness, and AI, there is a community of theoreticians that are working in this space. So you can do, that could be your core area of research, even as someone who's more theoretical.
That was a very nice question. Thank you. Anyone else?
I know we have, 5 more minutes?
5 more minutes, yeah. Okay, I'll cave. I'll give up. I'll be the one who says, can't take the social awkwardness anymore. So I really thought that the thing you said in the beginning of your talk was really quite fascinating to me about how it made me kind of think about data in a new way, which is it made me realize how all data basically contains some fossils. There are these fossils that exist that, and we're continually adapting and learning, and we're as you said, as a society, we're changing what we're thinking about, and our values are shifting. And there was a question to Larry 2 days ago about commercializing aspects on Mars, right? And we had a little bit of a discussion about the Dutch East India Company and the incentives that existed for them versus, and resource extraction. And, that seems completely foreign to us in this time because we've evolved, but it's still in the history books, and it still pervades all sorts of measurements, all sorts of data, all sorts of things we would maybe make decisions from. So it made me think about how we understand data. So if you talk to a historian, they'll sometimes say, no, this is a revisionist historian. And I think if you're saying revisionist, if you're using that as a qualifier, you don't know what history is. History is revisionist.
Right.
So what I wonder is, is there a revisionist data scientist? Is there a future position where someone says, oh, actually, this is a data set, and this is the data set we have, but this data set is sort of it needs to be reset for current context, needs to be re-important sampled or something. It just makes me think that there's a specialized curator position, which has to kind of take into account this idea that data are always out of date. They're always based on bad assumptions.
And that's a really good idea. So I think we've never really thought of it that way. It's about increasing our data and making sure we have representational data, but thinking about revising the data and actually saying that this is archaic, it doesn't match our norms, and therefore maybe we shouldn't even use it, but yet it's still part of our history.
Yeah.
That's an interesting concept.
Well, I don't know, but it's just something that kind of popped into my head from your talk. And good news, we've got one extra question here. It says, hi, Dr. Howard, great talk. A question. Okay, so this is a hard question for 2 minutes on the clock, but maybe we can start with it and we can come back to it in the later section as well. How can graduate students balance the fast-paced publication / output focus with incorporating equitable and inclusive design in our research?
Yeah, so I would say that it can be done and just so you know, I think, were you at Georgia Tech? So I know you can't answer that, but so I think one of the things is, there's this whole, publish or perish kind of thing. And a lot of times when you think about inclusive design, you think about bringing in people in terms of your design structure, it takes time. And so you don't publish as fast because it takes a longer time to bring in the networks and things like that. But I think you can do things basically in parallel, right? So you can publish the things that, I need to have this algorithm, I use toy data sets. And the fact is our community still publishes those things. Like I've read a lot of robotics papers. I'm like, there's not even a robot, but yet there's some aspect of theory that's grounded, right? And so you can do that. And then there's other papers that are, here's the theory, but now it's inclusive design, and it might take 2 years because you've actually had to collect the data from, real people, deploy, but then it allows you to do publications. You get multiple publications and allows you to do the things in terms of equitable inclusiveness, but also theory, get things out quickly, within a year, plus. And so I think it's a dual process. It takes a lot more work, but I think at the end, it also means that you cross the communities of theory as well as inclusive design and thinking about what is our role in terms of bringing in the community, the advocates, and the data sets from real life people in terms of our research and our outcomes.
Excellent. That's excellent advice. So thank you so much. We're at the top of the hour, and our question and answer said thank you so much too. Actually, almost simultaneously with when I said that. So 2 thumbs up. Thank you. So you've probably got an important meeting to go to, I imagine. So thank you. And if you have, to anyone in the audience, if you have further questions, you can submit them offline, or of course, I think it's in 9 hours, we have
another session. Yes.
Right, we can come back fresh-faced with a bunch of new questions. So thank you so much.
Thank you. We'll see you then.
Yeah, bye.
Bye.